Today, Addison, Alex, Sophia, and I will be covering the life of Piaget and his stage theory of cognitive development. His theory is one of the most famous in developmental psychology and is so widely used across the world in many different forms. Piaget's theory is the only stage theory widely recognized in developmental psychology, and that is what makes it so unique. Although there are criticisms, Piaget's theory of cognitive development is extremely important to know and understand when learning about psychology as a whole. But before we get to know more about his theory, it's important we learn about who he was as a person and how his life played out. On August 9th in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, Jean Piaget was born to Arthur Piaget and Rebecca Jackson. From a very young age, it was obvious that he had a future in science. He had been fascinated by the subject from the start of his academic career. In fact, he published his first scientific article when he was only 11 years old. The article in question was about an albino sparrow he had observed. By the time he finished high school, Piaget had developed such an intense interest in mollusks that he ended up being a well-known malacologist. Unsurprisingly, Piaget went on to earn a doctorate of zoology in 1918 from the University of Neuchâtel, where he also studied philosophy. Afterwards, he picked up an interest in psychology and spent a summer studying at the University of Zurich. Although his switch towards psychology may seem random, it actually combined his background in biology and philosophy very well. While at Zurich, Piaget studied under renowned psychiatrists such as Carl Jung and Eugene Bleuler, who helped him develop an interest in psychoanalysis. In 1919, Piaget left Switzerland for France, where he began working at a boys' institution created by Alfred Binet and directed by de Simon. Both men had collaborated to create the first IQ test, which Piaget standardized and administered for them. Historians cite this as being the first time he studied the minds of children. In 1921, he moved back to Switzerland and took on the position of Director of Studies at the J.J. Rousseau Institute in Geneva. Afterwards, he spent a few years as a child psychology professor at his alma mater, the University of Neuchâtel. Moving institutions again, he began working for the University of Geneva in 1929 and stayed until his death. While still in faculty there, he founded the International Center of Genetic Epistemology in 1955. Piaget was the director of the organization also until he died. Although there are no recordings stating his cause of death, we do know that he passed away on September 16, 1980. Now that we know about his life, let's visit how he developed his theory. Remember the boys' institution he taught at? That's where it all began. While administering the IQ test for Binet and de Simon, he took interest in the ways children answered the questions. He made the observation that many of the children, particularly those around the same age, made the same mistakes. This sparked his interest. He wanted to know the reason behind these consistently imperfect results. When developing his theory, Piaget relied heavily on direct observation. In fact, he used his own children as reference for his studies into childhood development. He reached the conclusion that children move through life in 4 different stages: the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. More on these later. Piaget noted that there was a gradual transition into each stage, and they didn't seem to end at a set point. Instead of them stacking on top of each other like building blocks, they gradually merged together as the child developed and transitioned from one stage to the next. While there are general similarities when it came to the age a child hits each developmental stage at, the time frame differs from child to child. Now that we have an idea of how he developed his theory, let's look into how it was received. Piaget published his findings in 1936 in a research paper titled The Origin of Intelligence in Children. As with most new scientific ideas, his theory was initially met with criticism. Many scientists felt that it was more of a case study than an actual experiment, which made them question whether his data could be applied broadly. Some criticized the fact that he had the tendency to equate a child's competency with their ability to complete a task. Others still doubted that development occurred in stages like he proposed. Regardless of the negative reviews, Piaget's research and findings had a major impact on research at the time. During this time in history, children were often thought of as mini adults and were treated as such. Once Piaget shed some light on how the minds of children work and develop, people began to reevaluate how they thought about children. His work prompted further research on child development and paved the way for many other developmental psychologists that followed him. Now that we've gone over the life of Piaget himself, discussed some of the ways he developed his theory, and talked a bit about how it was received at the time, it's time to talk more about the theory itself. And for that, I'll turn things over to Sophia.
So to get into it now, we have the ideas behind a theory. And the goal of the theory essentially is to explain the mechanisms and processes by which the infant and then the child develop into an individual who can reason and think using hypotheses. So some of these components to this theory are schemas, which are building blocks of knowledge, adaptations, processes that enable transition from one stage to another, and these are equilibrium, assimilation, and accommodation. And the stages of development, which are the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Alright, so to elaborate on schemas, they're just building blocks of information. Think of them as categories. They're a concept or a framework that allows us to organize and sort information based on how we interpret it. Piaget thought children sort information they acquire into these schemas and adapt to it. Adaptation in psychology is just when humans adjust to new information and experiences through either assimilation or accommodation. Assimilation is when you apply new knowledge to previous existing knowledge. For example, a child sees a new dog they haven't seen before, but they recognize it as a dog because it has dog-like characteristics like a tail, fuzzy ears, a snout, and it barks. And since they recognize this dog as a dog, they cry out, "Doggy!" The child is just applying previous knowledge on dogs to categorize this as a dog. Accommodation is when you adjust schemas to fit new information. For example, when a child has a schema for birds which fly, have feathers, and a beak, and it sees a plane which flies, but it doesn't have feathers or a beak, and therefore it wouldn't fit into the schema. Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development suggests that children move through 4 different stages of mental development. And you might ask, why stages? Well, he believed that children take an active role in the learning processes, acting much like little scientists as they perform experiments, make observations, and learn about the world. As these kids interact with the world around them, they continually add new knowledge, build upon existing knowledge, and adapt previously held ideas to accommodate new information. So now we get into the stages. There's the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2 years old. And some of the changes that come along are the coordination of senses with motor responses and sensory curiosity about the world. For example, this is why babies like to put things in their mouths or play around with things. They're just curious about how it feels. Language used for demands and cataloging, and object permanence is developed. And another example, children begin to recognize and appreciate symbols that represent objects, and they use simple language to catalog it. For example, doggy, or horsey, or kitty. Next we get into the pre-operational stage. This is from 2 to 7 years old, and it's characterized by the changes of symbolic thinking, use of proper syntax and grammar to express concepts, imagination and intuition, and those are strong, but complex, abstract thoughts are still difficult, and conservation is also developed. For example, imagine people or objects that don't exist, such as an imaginary friend. Next we get into the concrete operational stage, which is from 7 to 11 years old. This is characterized by concepts attached to concrete situations, and time, space, and quantity are also understood and can be applied, but not as independent concepts. For example, reversibility is developed. Children understand that some objects can be altered and then shaped back to their original state. An example of this is balloons can be deflated and then filled back up with air again. And now we have the formal operational stage, which is 11 years old and continues up into adulthood. So this is characterized by the changes of theoretical, hypothetical, and counterfactual thinking, abstract logic and reasoning. Strategy and planning become possible. Concepts learned in one concept can also be applied to another concept now. For instance, children can now consider the possible outcomes and consequences of actions without actually performing them.
Hey, psst, down here. Okay, listen, we're gonna make this quick. I messed up the timing of the next part, and I don't have enough time to fix it. So I need you to smile and nod and pretend like there's really cool graphics going on and not long, awkward sections of a repeating graphic, okay? It's cool at the end, I promise, and if anyone asks, you didn't see me. Okay, bye.
Now I'm going to talk about the modern views of Piaget's theory, starting with criticisms. One criticism concerns Piaget's terminology. From a scientific viewpoint, it is necessary to define new terms operationally. in other words, in the form of an operation which can be duplicated. Now, Piaget often did not do this, so it is difficult for others to assess the significance of his general findings because they cannot be easily and precisely replicated. For example, consider terms like accommodation and assimilation. Piaget offers these terms up many times to indicate a change that has occurred in a child. But what exactly has changed, people ask? Piaget does not offer a specific operationalized definition that would guide researchers to a link between observed behavioral changes in the mind. This lack of operational definitions provides a further difficulty. It becomes impossible for any other researcher to establish a cause and effect relationship among Piaget's variables. Now, another major criticism stems from the very nature of stage theory itself. The stages may be inaccurate or just plain wrong. Another psychologist has pointed out that Piaget may have underestimated the development of young children. They have conducted research that found that some children develop object permanence earlier than Piaget thought. Others point out that pre-operational children may be less egocentric than Piaget believed. Studies have shown that even a 3-year-old child is aware that an adult looking at a card from the opposite side of the child will be seeing a completely different view. Furthermore, individual differences may mean that children of similar ages may vary widely across the stages. In fact, some children may never achieve the level of formal operations. If children can show a mixture of different stages in their cognitive makeup, then what's the point of attempting to differentiate between different stages at all? Now, another criticism is leveled at Piaget's action-oriented approach. Piaget believed that physical manipulation of external objects is essential for normal cognitive development. Theorists have argued that children born without the physical capability of outward action, such as a paralyzed child or a child born without a limb, are still capable of normal cognitive development. Also, the physical nature of Piaget's theory fails to explain how children understand abstract words that don't necessarily relate to an immediately physical object. Now, lastly, a criticism leveled by the likes of Vygotsky chastises Piaget for his inattention to culturally specific influences on cognitive development. The children Piaget studied grew up in Geneva, a Western culture where children attend school and are trained in certain forms of thinking. Yet Piaget largely ignored these influences and attributed each child's intellectual growth to the individual's cognitive reaction to the environment. Later tests have shown that Piaget's formal operational period and even the concrete operational period are heavily dependent on formal Western schooling. Now, onto an opposing theory, the information processing theory. So, the information processing theory is how individuals perceive, analyze, manipulate, use, and remember information. Unlike Piaget's theory, this approach proposes that cognitive development is ongoing and gradual, and not organized into distinct stages. The areas of basic cognitive changes generally occur in 5 different areas. The first, attention. Improvements are seen in selective attention, which is focusing on one thing, as well as divided attention, which is multitasking. The second, memory. Improvements are seen in working memory and long-term memory. The third is processing speed. With maturation, children think more quickly. Processing speed improves sharply between ages 5 and middle adolescence, leveling off around age 15, and does not appear to change between late adolescence and adulthood. The fourth of these is organization of thinking. As children mature, they are more planful, they approach problems with strategy, and are flexible in using different strategies in different situations. Now the last one is metacognition. Older children can think about thinking itself. Now this involves monitoring one's own cognitive activity during the thinking process. Metacognition provides the ability to plan ahead, see the future consequences of an action, and provide alternative explanations of events. Now lastly, there are still theorists that base their studies off of Piaget. These are known as neo-Piagetians. Now, similar to Piaget's theory, they believe in constructivism, assume cognitive development can be separated into different stages, and advocate that children's thinking becomes more complex in advanced stages. However, unlike Piaget, they believe that aspects of information processing change the complexity of each stage, not in logic as determined by Piaget. Neo-Piagetians propose that working memory capacity is affected by biological maturation and therefore restricts young children's ability to acquire complex thinking and reasoning skills. So, increases in working memory performance and cognitive skills development coincide with the timing of several neurodevelopmental processes. These include myelination, which enables nerve cells to transmit information faster and allows for more complex brain processes, axonal pruning, which during development, neurons extend axons to more targets than are required for normal function in adulthood. This can lead to higher thinking and being able to process more things at once. And lastly, cerebral metabolism. So this brings more blood to the brain, which allows for more complex thinking. Additionally, all neo-Piagetian theories support that experience and learning interact with biological maturation and shaping cognitive development.
Hey guys, so I just wanted to come on here. I know you guys heard my classmates talk about Piaget's theory and different parts about the theory. I just wanted to come on here and talk about how Piaget is still used today, mainly focus on the education. So let's get started. So Piaget's theories were widely studied today by students of both psychology and education. In the case of the latter, he once said the principal goal of education in the schools should be creating men and women who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done. When I think about this, I think of things, in like high school, you have different programs, and it's not just English, math, science, and social studies. There's, cosmetology, there's shop, there's gym class can count as one, just different things. You have different studies in college. You can be a psych major, a nursing major, an engineer, different things. So just not doing the same thing, I also think of it like a lot of people, following in their parents' footsteps. And my mom was a hairdresser. My aunt's a hairdresser. Like, it was kind of, oh, are you going to do hair? You're going to, do what your mom and your aunt and my grandmother have done. It's just like a little bit of a change. Doing something different. By using Piaget's theory in the classroom, teachers and students benefit in several ways. Teachers are able to develop a better understanding of the students' thinking. They can also align their teaching strategies with their students' cognitive level. So when I think things like this, I also think of like everybody's on a different, learning scale, learning level, I guess you could say. Like I know in like elementary school and like middle school, they have you on like a reading level. I remember my sister was always way above like her grade. She's a third grader on the 8th grade reading level. Me, I was a third grader on the 3rd grade reading level. Like everybody's different. It's Piaget's theory of cognitive development in children has definitely shaped the way we understand still today. Like I said, it's still widely used throughout school systems around the world, and in the development of different curriculums. His idea produced the idea of ages and stages in childhood development. This idea is used to predict capabilities of what a child can and cannot understand, depending on the stage of development. Again, just like different learning levels, reading levels, what difficulties, like I was in a reading class and things like that. And some people weren't. I know there's, kids that get to skip a grade, or graduate early, because they're at a higher level. Excuse me. Piaget's major contribution to child psychology was the understanding of the children's construct, their own knowledge, and what they learned through experience. With this, educators can create and implement and assess the curriculum being taught, assuming throughout the process that the students can conserve consistencies. If a student were to lack this ability, they will not benefit academically, because they have limited concrete sensory data and literal interruptions. With this, they might have trouble in thinking abstractly, problem solving, planning, different things, time management, different things play part of this. A kid's, ADHD or something like that, it plays a part. So it's definitely still used to, in the education system today that we have today. I think that it's pretty solid. I think that his theory is very valid, with everything that we've talked about.